If you think your peaceful neighborhood is free of con artists, you're in for a wake-up call. Stay with me to the end to find out why, and don't skip a word. I moved to the Windy Oak subdivision in the suburbs of Ravenwood a little over a year ago. Quiet, cold as sacks, uniform lawns, and everyone greeting each other with polite waves. On the surface, it was the picture of suburban bliss. That's exactly the reason I'd chosen it. My job came with a truckload of stress, and I dreamed of an unassuming environment. Little did I know that behind the meticulously manicured hedges and the warm smiles, a sinister group had started exploiting the trust of unsuspecting homeowners. It all began with small notices slipping under front doors late at night. These notices were from a supposed homeowners association compliance unit. I'd never heard of it. Now, we do have a legitimate HOA, but it's run by a board of 5 residents, and we have quarterly meetings in the local library's community room. So, who on earth were these people calling themselves the HOA Compliance Division? None of my neighbors recognized those letterheads or the signatures. Still, many just shrugged it off. Half the neighborhood's a little older, half are busy families. Nobody wanted to jump to conclusions about a new wave of official-sounding papers. At first, the notices contained trivial reminders. Bins must be brought in by 6 p.m., no parking on sidewalks overnight. But they were typed in a strange font and carried an official-looking seal, a seal that definitely wasn't on our real HOA documents. They also included a phone number and the words Neighborhood Patrol. I made a couple of calls to actual HOA reps, who confirmed these notices had nothing to do with them. That's when my ears perked up. Before I go on, I should probably tell you something important about me. I'm a federal agent. Specifically, I work for a specialized investigative branch. You won't see me with a flashy jacket that says FBI or DEA. My work revolves around financial crimes, identity theft, and some related fields. Most of it is desk-heavy research, with the occasional on-site operation or undercover infiltration. I chose to keep that aspect of my life under the radar in Windy Oaks. Neighborhoods can be chatty, and for once, I just wanted to exist as regular Emily from the greenhouse at the end of Vista Drive. That anonymity was about to pay off big time. When the fake notices continued showing up, I took matters into my own hands. One Tuesday morning after my run, I spotted 2 men walking down the street in broad daylight, wearing matching navy blue polo shirts with an embroidered patch that said Windy Oaks Compliance. Something about them struck me as off. They used official-sounding jargon as they banged on Mrs. Thompson's door. Mrs. Thompson was a widow in her 70s who spent her afternoons pruning roses. Her yard was impeccable, so there was no reason for any real compliance check. I stepped onto my porch in time to see Mrs. Thompson open her door a crack. The pair exchanged words, though I was too far away to hear their conversation. But I did notice Mrs. Thompson's usual easygoing smile vanish. She looked startled, shook her head, then started shutting her door. The men in navy shirts placed their foot in the threshold, preventing her from closing it, and leaned in, brandishing some form of ID. Mrs. Thompson nodded hesitantly, and the door opened again. That was enough for me. I hustled down the street, acting casual. One of the men, tall with a crooked grin, stepped outside, leaving the other presumably in Mrs. Thompson's entryway. "Can I help you, fellas?" I called. He barely glanced at me. "Official HOA business, ma'am," he said in a tone as if I'd just asked him the color of the sky. "Please return to your home. We're conducting an inspection." "Really?" I asked, studying the embroidered patch on his sleeve. The design looked cheaply made, probably from one of those online shops that do quick custom embroidery. My gut told me these guys had neither the training nor the official capacity to be on Mrs. Thompson's property. Mrs. Thompson looked alarmed but didn't say a word, as if she was trying to avoid more trouble. She'd probably been coerced into letting them in. I decided to back off for the moment, not wanting to start a confrontation right there. They watched me walk away as I marched back to my house, all the while itching to do something. As a federal agent, I've learned that charging in without a plan can get you or others hurt. And since I was off duty, no backup, no warrant, no immediate threat to life or limb. I needed to play by the book to gather evidence. That night, I walked up and down the street under the guise of taking out the trash, trying to catch glimpses of any suspicious activity. Sure enough, those same men cruised slowly through the neighborhood in a black SUV with tinted windows. They pulled into a driveway, hopped out, and hammered on the door like they had an urgent police matter. I could see from the glow of a porch lamp that the house belonged to a retired couple known as the Hendersons. My chest tightened. Something told me these folks, especially the more vulnerable retirees, were being targeted. Fear, confusion, or even the old-fashioned trust in official uniforms might push them to comply. If anything was demanded, money, access to personal records, some neighbors might just hand it over, not wanting trouble with the HOA cops. I made a silent vow to figure out who they were and what exactly they wanted. The next day, I called the local detective I had worked with in the past. He was off duty for 2 weeks, out of town with his family. That left me with the option of filing an official complaint with the county sheriff's department, risking a bureaucratic backlog that might spook the suspects if the case got bungled or delayed. I decided it was time to do some personal reconnaissance. Every few months, our real HOA circulated a list of local vendors, gardeners, house painters, plumbers, to help folks who couldn't do the heavy lifting themselves. I checked that document. Of course, no Windy Oaks compliance or neighborhood patrol was listed. I then scoured the county website. There was no permit or license filed under that name. It was shaping up to be exactly what it looked like, a shakedown scheme. But the question remained, how? If it was just a shakedown, they'd be demanding money left and right. Yet, so far, Mrs. Thompson, who eventually confided in me, hadn't reported them asking for cash. Instead, she told me they had scolded her about a supposed drainage violation, took pictures of her property, and left after warning her that the fine would appear on her next HOA invoice. Odd. You don't get many cons who walk away from an easy extortion situation without collecting. If they weren't after money, could it be they were scoping out houses for theft? That was a possibility. Or maybe they were rummaging through personal documents to steal IDs. Mrs. Thompson said they stared at her mail slot and rummaged near her front desk. Alarm bells rang in my head. This had identity theft operation written all over it. With everything swirling around, I started my own stakeout. I requested a week of leave, citing family obligations. If these guys were operating daily, I wanted to see it in real time. Early the next morning, I pretended to go for another jog, but actually circled the block with my phone camera ready. I nabbed a few shots of their black SUV as it cruised by. The driver was that tall, crooked-grin man from before. His partner was shorter, stocky, possibly in his 50s, wearing the same navy polo. They stopped at a corner house that belonged to an elderly gentleman, Mr. Milligan. Within minutes, the men were on his doorstep. They flashed some ID, had a conversation I couldn't hear, and then one of them vanished inside the house while the other kept watch outside. After about 10 minutes, they left. Mr. Milligan remained behind his door, presumably shaken. It was time I had an actual conversation with one of the victims. A few hours later, I swung by Mr. Milligan's home under the pretext of dropping off a neighborhood fundraiser flyer. When he answered the door, his face looked pale, and he was unusually tight-lipped, even for the stoic man I knew. He finally admitted that the men claimed they needed to inspect his basement for a foundation crack that was causing water to leak into adjacent properties. Pure nonsense, as our houses aren't even directly connected like row houses. At first, I said no, Mr. Milligan recounted. But they showed me this paper that said they had the right to access the property. The paper looked official enough, had some legal ease, but I barely got to read half of it before they marched on in. They took pictures. They kept asking me if I'd had trouble with mail theft before. Then they looked around my living room, asked weird questions about my insurance, my medication. It was unsettling. Alarm bells were practically clanging in my head. Asking about medication was possibly a tactic to gauge if the homeowner was vulnerable, lonely, or had expensive prescription drugs they could later steal. They also asked about mail theft, maybe to see if any credit card statements or checks were lying around. It was a perfect opportunity for them to gather personal info. I thanked Mr. Milligan, then left under the guise of needing to run errands. Instead, I hopped into my own SUV and followed the black-tinted vehicle once it appeared on the far side of the neighborhood. This time, they only drove a few streets down before parking in an unoccupied driveway, possibly to look inconspicuous. The stocky man took out a notepad and started scribbling. It occurred to me that I might be dealing with something bigger than a local ring. There was a methodical nature to their approach, identifying vulnerable residents, using official-looking documents, taking specific notes. These weren't amateurs, but they did slip up in one crucial aspect. They underestimated the neighborhood's watchful eyes. I bided my time over the next couple of days. I collected more photos and videos. I jotted down license plate numbers of the black SUV and, once, a white van they seemed to use to haul gear. I took nighttime walks to see if they were surveilling us after dark, and sure enough, I caught them rolling past Mrs. Thompson's place around 1 a.m. The final straw came on Thursday morning when I found a pink notice pinned to my door. It read, "Scheduled compliance inspection. 48-hour notice." The audacity of it almost made me laugh. They had the nerve to show up at my place. Of all people, me, a federal agent. But what if I was just an average resident? That pink notice was intimidating. It included language about mandatory access and failure to comply may result in fines or legal action. They planned to check my home on Saturday morning at precisely 9 a.m. What they didn't know was that I had a surprise waiting for them. I set up my living room to discreetly record the entire encounter. Micro cameras hidden among the books on my shelves, voice recorders cleverly placed behind potted plants. My plan was simple. Let them come in, let them do their usual charade, and capture every incriminating second. I'd have enough evidence to turn over to the local authorities, maybe even build a federal case if we discovered these guys were crossing state lines or working a bigger scam. That night, I barely slept. My federal training told me that these folks, if cornered, could become dangerous. They might carry weapons, or they might have a larger network. But this was my home. They were coming onto my turf under false pretenses. Little did they know, they were walking into the lair of a federal agent who was about to blow their cover wide open. At 8:59 a.m. on Saturday, I sat in my armchair with a cup of coffee, feigning disinterest. I wore a plain sweater and jeans, trying to play the part of an unsuspecting, slightly irritated homeowner. Sure enough, at exactly 9 a.m., there was a knock at my door, firm, quick raps that conveyed authority. My heart rate rose, but I kept my composure. If all went as planned, I'd have everything on record. I opened the door to find the same two men from before, decked out in their navy blue polos with a counterfeit Windy Oaks compliance patch. The tall one gave me that crooked grin. The shorter, stocky one crossed his arms like he expected me to cower. "Good morning," I said, letting a tinge of annoyance slip into my voice. "You're a bit early." "It's 9 a.m. "Exactly." The tall one tapped his watch. "We're here for your compliance inspection." I shrugged. "Didn't realize I had to let you in." He handed me a folded sheet of paper, the same kind of nonsense I'd seen him show others. "In accordance with Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Windy Oaks HOA Charter, we have the right to inspect any property for safety and compliance violations." I cocked an eyebrow. "That's interesting, because I attend the official HOA meetings, and I've never heard of that paragraph." "You might not be familiar with the updated bylaws," the shorter man chimed in. "We've been contracted by the board to enforce these rules." I pressed my lips together as if uncertain. "I guess I don't want any trouble. Come on in." They stepped inside with an air of self-importance, scanning my living room as though they were picking out places to hang citations. It took everything in me not to roll my eyes. The tall one pulled a small flashlight from his belt. "We'll need to check your basement, attic, and any external doors. Also, do you have any firearms on the premises?" My heart gave a small jolt. That was a new question. I shook my head. "No, no firearms." Of course, I had a secured handgun locked in a safe in the bedroom, but I wasn't about to mention that. They nodded. The shorter man whipped out a camera, presumably to photograph violations. He pointed. "We'll start over there." I led them toward the basement door, which opened off the kitchen. One by one, we descended the steep stairs into a half-finished basement that mostly served as my storage area. Boxes lined one side, and a laundry nook occupied the other. The tall man's flashlight beam flickered across the walls, then settled on my water heater. He squatted down, examining the pipes. "This looks like it might be out of code," he muttered. "Really?" I asked. "It's only 3 years old. Had a professional install it." He shrugged, pulling out a phone to snap photos. "We see this a lot. Companies cut corners." The shorter guy was rifling through a box labeled Old Documents. "What's this?" he asked in a tone that suggested I had to answer him like he was a real cop. "Personal paperwork," I said, stepping closer and shutting the lid. "You have no reason to look at that, do you?" He glanced at me coldly. We need to verify you're up to date on your HOA fees, permits, and so forth. A wave of satisfaction coursed through me. Caught on camera rummaging through personal files, buddy. But outwardly, I huffed. I pay everything online. Anything else you need to see? The tall man stood up. We'll also need to check your attic and bedroom for any structural issues. That was crossing a line for sure. No real HOA inspection, even if you gave them permission, would just meander around your bedrooms. I let my shoulders sag, playing the exasperated homeowner. Fine, but make it quick. I have an appointment soon. As we headed upstairs, my phone, placed discreetly on the kitchen counter, was capturing everything in living color. The men paused to open a closet door, scanning for who knows what. The shorter one saw an unopened box of checks in my little home office. He actually reached inside, flipping the top of the box up as if about to take a look at my bank account information. I snapped. Hey, are you even allowed to do that? He lowered his voice, adopting a patronizing tone. Cooperation makes things smoother, ma'am. If you don't comply, we'll have to mark it as an immediate violation. I was seething inside, but I had to let the charade continue. The best evidence was them incriminating themselves. So, I feigned intimidation, stepping back with a meek nod. Meanwhile, I knew every angle of that little office was in the camera's line of sight. Finally, they insisted on seeing my bedroom, claiming it was necessary to inspect for anything that might pose a hazard. The tall man pulled open drawers, scanning for valuables by the looks of it. The shorter man gave a quick glance inside my closet. At one point, he asked if I took any prescription medications. My hair stood on end because it was an echo of what Mr. Milligan had mentioned. I shook my head. Nothing but a vitamin or two. They exchanged a glance, almost disappointed. The shorter man stepped toward me. And you said no firearms, correct? Correct, I replied. Are we done here? He sniffed, checking the time on his phone. One last thing. Any valuables you need to declare? Jewelry, safes, anything? If there's a theft in the neighborhood, we need to make sure everything is documented for insurance. Well, played, but I pretended not to know better. No safes, just a ring or two in the jewelry box over there. He actually walked over to the box, opening it without permission, rifling through my modest collection of rings and bracelets. My pulse hammered in my ears. This was borderline burglary under the guise of compliance. They were probably confirming how profitable it would be to come back at night, or maybe they planned to pickpocket an item or two right now. Before things could escalate, I cleared my throat. I think you've seen enough. I need you to leave now. They stared at me, momentarily taken aback by my firm tone. But I was done playing the pawn. I repeated, please go. I have your notice, and if there's an issue, I'll call the real HOA myself. The tall man's eyes flickered as if weighing whether to press his luck further. Then, with a nod to his partner, they backed out of my bedroom and stomped down the stairs, presumably satisfied they'd gleaned enough. I followed them to the front door, capturing every step with the small camera near the coat rack. The shorter man turned back at the threshold. We'll be in touch regarding your compliance status, he said, voice dripping with the confidence of a man who believed he had me under his thumb. I mustered a polite nod. Sure thing. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, I let out a shaky exhale. Now, I had them on record committing unlawful entry, rummaging through personal documents, and basically harassing me for valuables. It was solid evidence. Yet, a bigger question loomed. How many more were involved? My next step was to call my contact at the local police station. Then, I planned to escalate this up the chain at my federal agency. But fate had other plans. The men apparently weren't satisfied with a partial rummage through my home. They wanted more, and they weren't going to wait for another inspection. That night, I decided I'd take everything I had, photos, videos, testimonies, and walk into the station first thing in the morning. But in the meantime, I wasn't about to sleep peacefully with those goons prowling around. I locked every window, double-checked the back door, and stashed my weapon on the nightstand, easily accessible, just in case. Around 2:15 a.m., a faint scraping noise startled me awake. For a moment, I thought it might be the wind. But then came a gentle click, as if someone was trying to pick a lock. My instincts flared. I grabbed my phone and my firearm, heart pounding but focus razor sharp. I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway. I disabled every squeaky floorboard in my house over the years, an old habit from my law enforcement background. The scraping intensified at the back door. I peeked through the slats of the window shade and saw a figure hunched there, fiddling with the doorknob. Another silhouette stood watch near the corner of my yard. It's them, I thought, adrenaline surging. They've come back. My mind raced. If I called 911, it might take minutes before a patrol car arrived. That was too long for a burglary in progress. However, I was a federal agent. That gave me certain authority, but also a responsibility. If I confronted them, I needed to do so without risking a shootout or personal harm. I retreated, took a steady breath, and dialed 911. I whispered my address, reporting an active break-in. The dispatcher promised units were on the way. Then, I flicked off every light in the house, hoping to hide my movements. The intruder finally succeeded in popping the lock. My stomach lurched at the sight of my back, doors swinging open. The figure slunk in, wearing dark clothing. The half-moon light from the window illuminated a glimpse of his face. It was the tall man, minus the phony navy polo. In his hand, he held a small crowbar. He advanced into my kitchen with practiced stealth, scanning the darkness for alarm systems or cameras. Meanwhile, the other man quietly followed, leaving the door ajar for a quick exit. I kept to the shadows, hugging the wall. My phone was already set to record audio. I took a slow, silent inhale. One man was heading toward the living room, where he'd rummaged before. The other tore into the office nook. They moved with chilling efficiency, opening drawers, checking for valuables. Enough was enough. I advanced, flipping on a single lamp in the living room, shining a beam of light that froze the tall man in place. My firearm was trained on him, but low enough to show I wasn't about to fire unless threatened. Federal agent, I barked. Drop the crowbar. Hands where I can see them. The tall man's eyes went wide with shock. He glanced back at his partner, who hovered just behind him, also stunned. The shorter man sputtered, Federal agent? We didn't. I cut him off, voice as steady as I could manage. I've got you on camera, and the police are on their way. Don't do anything stupid. The tall man's crowbar clattered to the floor. He slowly raised his hands. The shorter man hesitated, then followed suit. I kept my weapon trained, stepping closer to the door to ensure they didn't bolt. For a moment, the tension was suffocating. Then, the distant wail of sirens shattered the silence. The cavalry was coming. The shorter man threw a desperate glance at his partner, eyes screaming panic. The tall man clenched his jaw. They both knew it was over. Within minutes, police lights flickered outside. Officers burst in, guns drawn, quickly securing the two men in handcuffs. The lead officer was initially bewildered to find me calm, weapon in hand, identifying myself with a federal badge. Once they realized what had happened, they thanked me for maintaining control until they arrived. I had enough evidence, from the rummaging earlier that day to the break-in that night, to lock these two up on burglary charges, potentially more once the authorities combed through their fake documents and discovered how they manipulated unsuspecting residents. As the officers hauled them out, the tall man sneered one last time. You just blew this, lady. You have no idea who you're messing with. I met his glare with an unwavering gaze. That's where you're wrong. I know exactly who I'm messing with, and now, so does law enforcement. The next few days were a blur of statements, evidence logging, and calls from neighbors. Word traveled fast that Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Milligan, the Hendersons, and I, among others, had all been targeted by a group posing as HOA cops. People were outraged, terrified, relieved, a mixed bag of emotions. But the consensus was clear. No one would let con artists exploit the trust we had in our neighborhood again. The official investigation widened when the police found reams of stolen personal information in the criminals' rented storage unit. Apparently, they were part of a larger network that specialized in identity theft. The angle was straightforward. Gain entry under the guise of an HOA inspection, photograph or steal important documents, gather data about valuables, then either rob the residents or sell their identities on the black market. Thanks to my footage, cooperation from victims, and the timely police response, the local DA's office had an ironclad case. There would be no escaping justice. Not long after, our legitimate HOA took steps to reassure residents, emailing official disclaimers. We do not conduct surprise home inspections. Always contact the HOA board directly to confirm any inspection. They also recommended installing security cameras, forming a real neighborhood watch, and staying connected through community bulletins. For me, the whole experience was a stark reminder that criminals can show up anywhere, even behind neatly trimmed hedges in friendly suburbs with picket fences. Being a federal agent gave me training and tools to respond, but the real message is for everyone, especially older homeowners who could be prime targets. Stay vigilant, ask questions, and when something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. If you or someone you know has concerns about suspicious activity in their community, don't wait. Report it. Share this story to protect others from becoming victims. And remember, no fancy polo shirt or letterhead should ever override your common sense or your right to feel safe at home. The con men posing as HOA cops didn't count on me being a federal agent. They also didn't count on a neighborhood that was ready to rally around each other once the truth came to light. In the end, their fake badges, lies, and intimidation tactics crumbled under the weight of real law enforcement and the unwavering resolve of a Fed determined to defend her home turf. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the Windy Oaks subdivision became a model for community vigilance. Neighbors who had once been strangers now greeted each other with more than just polite waves. We formed a neighborhood watch with regular meetings and a shared commitment to keeping our streets safe. Security cameras sprouted like daisies, and the HOA implemented stricter protocols to verify any official inspections. The two men I had confronted were just the tip of the iceberg. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement uncovered a sprawling network of identity thieves operating across multiple states. The fake HOA inspections were just one of their many schemes. They had been preying on vulnerable communities for years, exploiting trust and fear to gain access to personal information and valuables. Thanks to the evidence I had gathered, the local DA was able to build a robust case. The two men were charged with burglary, identity theft, and impersonating law enforcement. Their trial was swift, and the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. They were sentenced to significant prison terms, and the investigation led to the dismantling of their entire operation. For me, the experience was a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and community. As a federal agent, I'm trained to handle threats, but this was different. This was my home, my sanctuary. The thought that someone could violate that space, under the guise of authority, was deeply unsettling. But it also reinforced my belief in the power of community. When we come together, when we look out for one another, we can protect ourselves from even the most insidious threats. The Windy Oaks subdivision is stronger now, more connected, and more aware. We've learned that safety isn't just about locks and alarms, it's about trust, communication, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. So, if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember this story. Trust your instincts, ask questions, and don't be afraid to take action. Because in the end, it's not just about protecting your home. It's about protecting the people and the community that make it worth living in. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.